Welcome, everyone, to this webinar of the Institute of Current World Affairs. I'm Gregory Feifer, the Executive Director. Thank you for joining us today, especially during this possibly pivotal week in American history, when our domestic events have prompted mass protests in capitals around Europe and elsewhere. It's partly because of our role in the world as the guarantor of transatlantic security that what happens here resonates around the world. And it's because our most important alliances are being shaken and our commitments to crucial international institutions, such as the World Health Organization, are being severed, that we believe the work of the Institute is especially important today. Our fellows spend 2 years immersed in countries around the world. We seek outstanding young people of high promise, free them from the routines of their professional lives, and give them the time and resources to explore the world on self-designed programs of study, thought, and writing. They gain deep knowledge of foreign societies and cultures, the kind of understanding of foreign affairs this country will need to restore its beneficial role supporting liberal democratic values around the world. But of all the countries where we sent fellows, the institution's association with China may be its deepest, starting right from the beginning with our founder, Charles Crane. President Woodrow Wilson appointed him ambassador to China several years before Crane founded ICWA in 1925 to advance American knowledge of foreign affairs when this country had just emerged as a great power. The Institute has since sent more than a dozen fellows to China, including the leading scholars Doak Barnett, who helped persuade Presidents Johnson and Nixon to reopen relations with China, Cheng Li, who currently heads China Studies at the Brookings Institution, and Joe Batat, whose fellowship based in Shanghai in the 1970s enabled him to observe the first major capitalist transformation. He went on to teach at MIT after working for the World Bank for 26 years, including as head of its Foreign Investment Advisory Services. Our China Fellows also include a longtime foreign correspondent named Albert Ravenholt, seen here interviewing General Claire Chennault of Flying Tigers fame. Ravenholt grew up on a Wisconsin dairy farm before becoming a reporter for the United Press in China during World War II, riding elephant back along the winding Burma Road into the Chinese interior. He also accompanied bomber crews on raids into Burma. One flight, loaded with 4 tons of bombs, crashed on the runway. He survived and later returned to China for his ICWA fellowship. Afterwards, he went on to a distinguished reporting career covering the communist takeover of mainland China and quizzing Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh about political philosophy. Our latest China Fellow is Matt Chitwood, who continues their storied tradition. Matt spent a brilliant 2 years in rural Yunnan, China's southwesternmost province. He renovated and lived in an abandoned mud brick house in the remote mountain village of Bangdong, population 350, surrounded by terraced hillsides where locals grow prized tea crops. He became a talented chronicler of the lives of his neighbors, and many others across the region, which he traversed not on elephant back, but motorcycled, observing massive infrastructure development and an anti-poverty campaign that is radically transforming the countryside and life there. I will let him explain that himself and only say that Matt previously worked in China helping run study abroad programs and holds a master's in China studies from Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's since written for The New Republic, Foreign Policy, and the American Interest magazines, and he's currently working on a book based on his fellowship research. So Matt will talk for about 20 minutes, and then participants can ask questions for another approximately 40 minutes. So to ask a question, please click on the hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom box to virtually raise your hand. We'll see your requests and pick you chronologically, and you'll be muted until I call on you to speak. Please introduce yourself and ask a single brief question. And ICWA's Rebecca Picard is also on the line and will help respond and troubleshoot. So with that, Matt, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Greg. It's so good to be here. And first, a huge thanks to ICWA for making this experience possible. This was truly a life-changing experience for me. So grateful for the opportunity. Thanks especially to the generosity of Bob Levinson for making that possible, for the team at ICWA, Greg, for your leadership and your help in the editing, all of that work, for Rebecca, for all your work behind the scenes as well. For previous ICWA fellows who have encouraged me along the way, Dan Wright, Chung Lee, Joe Batat, a whole list of those. And a big thanks to my parents as well, who let me go to this far-flung village. Thanks all of you today for joining as well. It looks like there's over 100 people here, and I'm just very honored to be able to share with you today. Like Greg mentioned, I talked to a lot of people. Before I left, I got to speak with Jean Barnett. She was the wife of one of the original ICWA fellows, Doak Barnett. And she said what Doak did so well was talk to everyone along the way. And so I tried to do that all across Yunnan, which means I have far too many stories and far too many people that are worth mentioning. So I'll try to keep my remarks as short as possible, but definitely lots to share. First, a little bit of background on how I ended up in China, or how I ended up rather in Guangdong. I remember when I was working at the Gates Foundation, putting together a PowerPoint presentation there, pulling up some photos of some rice farmers. And I remember experiencing a certain amount of disconnect between this rice farmer that I was typing about on this PowerPoint presentation, and then looking out from the 18th story there in Beijing over the city, and just realizing this dearth of knowledge, a knowledge gap between my reality there in the city and the rest of China. Now, Gates Foundation does phenomenal work, but just my personal experience in that gap of knowledge. The rural population is about 550 million in China, which is a huge number, 1.5% or 1.5 times the US population. So a very important demographic that I realized I thought I knew something about China, thought I understood about China, but knew that if I don't understand that demographic, I don't grasp the realities that China is facing or the policies coming out of Beijing. So when I heard about ICWA, who asked, if you could do anything you want for 2 years, go anywhere, learn anything, my immediate response was rural China. And so came up with this crazy idea to go to the middle of nowhere in Yunnan. So let's see, I need to be able to share my screen here. And it says it's disabled right now. Any idea, Rebecca, how I can go ahead and share that?
You should be able to go into your security settings and enable it. But if you've done it before, then it should already be enabled, right?
Currently, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Sorry, that's me. Okay, you should be able to do it now.
All right, here we go. Okay, so just to give you a sense of where I was, this is China. Yunnan province is that southwest corner, as you can see, bordering Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar. And it's just an incredible place with intense diversity across the province, from the foothills of the Himalayas, really extending down to the tropics there along the border with Vietnam. And you see this diversity in the people across the province as well. Incredible amount of diversity, the most diverse province in all of China. We often think of China as a homogenous place, where everyone is the same across the spread, but it's a massive country with incredible diversity across that geographic people groups, flora and fauna as well. Probably the best example of flora and fauna are these two photos I have of animals across this province. This is a yak, and that's my dad on a yak up in the north around the Himalayas. And here's my mom on an elephant. I was fortunate they got to come out to visit me. So just a spread of diversity across the province. So I was based, as Greg said, in this small province, the small village, really in the middle of that province, really in the middle of nowhere. And this is a shot from that village, mountains, tea terraces you can see up and down the mountainside. This is a cow herd from the village, bringing the cows back for the day. So it's a small place. Really, no one goes there. And this is where I live there in the village. As Fred mentioned, it's a mud brick house. This is traditional style architecture. This would have been built, I think, 1982. It's actually the same year that I was built. Place to be when I got there. No water, no electricity, no bathroom. Here, it had been abandoned for years. Lots of chickens there, some rats, some bats. I only found one snake skin when I moved in. And yeah, just to give you a sense of what village life then looked like as I was there. I kind of the routines that I got into was trying to spend time with people around the village and in their daily life. So whether that was tea picking, understanding the tea processing. It is a tea village. Tea is their main product that they produce, as well as walnuts, coffee, and then subsistence farming. And so understanding the tea process, going with them to construction jobs in surrounding villages. These are some guys that have done migrant labor outside the village. And so they have the skills to do jobs there around the village. You can see them. They like to do construction jobs in their sandals and without welding glasses, but good people. And then getting into the routines of the village. So this is the market that would come through a nearby village, about 6 miles away, a place called Porto. And this rotating village would come through every 5 days, and that's where people could go to buy their fruits and vegetables, their meat. There were little noodle shops there, and things that you need for daily life. This was actually during Chinese New Year. You can see a lot of red, the lanterns and Chinese knots up. So it was quite a bit more people than would typically be there. But that was a regular routine of life for me. And so, there you always get into interesting conversations with people. They thought I was a tea boss there to work, or they thought that I was a teacher teaching English nearby. It was actually misreported in a local news report about tea and me, where they misreported me as a Time magazine reporter there. So all sorts of rumors running around, including that I was there to find a local wife. So it was an interesting kind of center of rural life there. People would always say, hey, I saw you playing a song on your guitar this week, or hey, I saw you, aren't you that guy that was helping build that international road? Because people, whatever activities were going on in Bangdong village, people would send out over WeChat, a messaging app, social media, and everyone would see that in the village. So a very interesting community. My routine, would be to try to be involved in people's daily life. I would typically cook there in my house, but also try to strategically take strolls around the village at meal times and see if I could have some meals with people there in the village as well. They were always incredibly hospitable and generous. As I would stroll around, invariably they would say, "Come, have dinner with us, or have some tea with us," and just incredible opportunity to sit and chat with them. And one of the best things that came from my experience in the village was friendship with many people, but especially this man. So his name is Liu Dage, or Big Brother Leo. He helped me renovate the old house. This is us putting in a bathroom there. But so he's a 50-year-old guy. He used to be the mayor of the village, and just a very kind and generous man, also with a biting sense of humor. When my parents came to visit, he would say, when your parents come and they hate your old house because they thought it was old and dirty and gross, when they hate your old house and the rats and they're crying and can't sleep, he invited them to come sleep at his house. So my favorite times were joining him for a meal, sitting around a fire of corn cobs and chewing sunflower seeds and conversations with him. And I remember one day after working on the house, we were walking on this road through Bangdong back to his house for dinner. And mind you, when I first moved to the village, this road was actually just dirt or mud. There's about 6 months of rainy season there every year. And so we were walking along this muddy road, and we stopped there. And I had one of those moments looking out towards the mountains and the clouds and the terraces and the bamboo. And I thought, oh my gosh, breathing in the fresh air, this is an incredible place. And I asked him, Brother Leo, like, do you ever get tired of this, or do you even appreciate, the beauty of this? Do you know, what you have here? And he looked out at those same mountains, and he said to me, those mountains are why we are poor. So his perspective on those mountains that I saw as beautiful and lush and green and an incredible resource, he saw as a barrier to development, a barrier to improvement of life, and really the cause of their poverty. So it struck me just how different perspectives we could have on something as simple as mountains. And then when you factor in cultural and political and religious and historical differences, really the divergence of perspectives that we could have. So that was really the start of digging in deep into a lot of conversations with people and trying to understand rural perspectives on life, on China, on the world. Because if we can look at mountains so differently, certainly these other things we also see and understand very, very differently. So I'll share 2 main points today. And one of the first points is just the idea that it was hard for me to grasp the challenges and the vulnerabilities of life in rural China, where there are virtually no safety nets. My background comes from all sorts of, senses of security, right? Insurance, social safety nets through NGOs or through government programs or our own private means, contingency plans. But here they have their land, and that's about it. And even that is tenuous. And so a very challenging and insecure existence in a lot of ways. So when you live in places like this is not Bangdong village. This is actually in Nujiang, northwestern Yunnan province near the Myanmar border that I got to visit. But when you live in places like this is not prime real estate. This is remote, middle of nowhere real estate, where there are no roads, no access, tremendous challenges like that. As an example of Yunnan more broadly. About 10 years ago, 40% of all people in Yunnan had no access to paved roads nearby their residences. That's dramatic. Bangdong itself, it was about maybe 20 or so years ago, it was 2 days walking from Bangdong to the nearest urban center, 2 days walking. Whereas now it's about a 4-hour drive. Granted, it's only about 45 miles, 4 hours to go 45 miles. So very, very long journey to get through there. So that vulnerability of life, it's hazards in jobs, it's hazards in lifestyle, it's hazards in customs. You saw the photo earlier of people doing construction work in sandals. While I was there, people in the village falling off construction jobs, falling off houses while they were re-roofing houses, driving off of cliffs. This is the Odaga's son, Ahua, and he drove truck, the diesel truck that you can see behind him there. And very close to the end of my fellowship in the village, he was driving up that new paved road that you saw in Bandung in that picture. He was driving on a hill in the village that had been recently paved, and that stone paving gave out, and his truck just tumbled down the hill, actually into my backyard of my home there. And he was graciously thrown from the truck, and they suspect that's the only reason why he survived that. He was in the hospital about 6 days. But there's this hazard that by nature of life, by nature of jobs, sense of safety. One day I was riding my motorcycle back to the village, and there was a woman in the ditch alongside the road, and she had fallen down about a 10, 15-foot embankment while she was picking tea. And she was there bleeding, bruised, her face was incredibly swollen. And so then the question is, how do you have access to healthcare? It's, the nearest hospitals are 4 hours away on awful roads. So if anything does happen, what happens to you? And I experienced this personally, working on my house with a saw that has no guard on it, because that's what everyone uses, and got electrocuted by this saw, and it zipped on my finger, just about cut my finger off there. So I had to go 4 hours away just to get a tetanus shot for that. But imagine if that was a more serious injury, saw taking off a limb or getting an artery. You have no access to healthcare there. Some of the hazards also include migrant labor, people who go out to work in big cities, lots of construction workers from Bandung village that would go out. It's hard work, very low pay, no social safety net, no social benefits, a lot of discrimination around that. I got to go out and visit the construction sites and do the annual migration back for Chinese New Year with with this friend Bao Hong, and so got to have some really unique insight into what their life is actually looking like, and the challenges that they're facing. So healthcare, access to education, low pay, just risks, the vulnerabilities of life that they experience day in and day out. And so as a result of that, as I was learning more about these challenges of life in general, the impact of infrastructure development and the impact of the government's poverty elimination campaign became increasingly clear to me, the importance of that. So in 2013, President Xi Jinping, he became president in 2012. 2013, he put out this goal that China should eradicate rural poverty by 2020, which is a very bold goal. And in 2015, that actually became national legislation. And why this is significant, previous leadership had been involved in poverty alleviation work, in trying to improve social programs for poor people across the country. But President Xi was the first one to make it what they say a SMART goal, S-M-A-R-T, standing for specific, measurable, achievable, results oriented, I forget, and then time bound. He was the first person to actually set out this goal of eliminating rural poverty, the goal being 2020. And so the question is, are they actually going to achieve that goal or not? The first and foremost, let me lay out a little bit what that looks like, what the metrics are and how they do it. So basically the metrics are to have one standard, roughly $500 US annual per capita income. So if you have a family of 6, for example, $3,000 US annual income is the baseline for that. The 2 non-worries, so food and clothes, guaranteeing that you don't have to worry about food and clothes, and then 3 guarantees, so housing, safe housing, access to healthcare, and education. So if you have these things, that's the baseline. If you're above that, then you are considered not poor, or not at least abject rural poverty. So they have had this mass campaign, all government resources thrown at this, and gone around to get metrics on this. So going through each household, setting up what's called 简单例卡, so setting up a file on each person. And this is what it looks like. As you see in the photo here, this is a friend of mine in the village. And it's basically all the personal information about income, land, livestock or crops, and a 10-point plan to get them out of poverty, and assigned a caseworker as well to make sure that happened. So just tremendous amount of resources have been thrown at this. You can see since she put this out as a goal in 2013 up until this is the latest I have through 2017, and it's certainly been even more money than that. I forget the figure offhand for the last 2 years, but lots and lots of resources, and not just money. It's also state workers that are paired up with each of these people, and universities and healthcare workers, and anyone that has a connection to the state is assigned to work on this as priority number 1. So it's really been a war on poverty, and they speak of it in those terms as well, war on poverty, in terms of mobilizing resources. And here's what the numbers look like in terms of reducing poverty. So 2012, starting out with around 100 million who were below that line. And the latest number is actually 5.5 million at the end of 2019. That was confirmed in a press conference recently by the State Council of Information Office. So, dramatic reduction. In Bandung, what's that specifically looked like? 5,000 households a couple years ago to end of last year, 101 households were still below that poverty line. How have they done that? A lot of stipend payments to people, increasing their income. But the most dramatic has been in free money and interest-free loans to people to build new houses in the village. So tearing down the old traditional structures that I lived in and building new 2-story, 3-story concrete houses that people are living in. One thing that looked like in the village as well was building bathrooms. Everyone got new bathrooms that were connected to running water, cinder block bathrooms like this. So just very, very dramatic. That house in the background that you see there, that wood structure, that's completely torn down now. So dramatic changes across the village. One way they've done that as well, not in Bandung specifically, but relocation villages that I saw across the province. And these are some examples of what these look like, relocating people from remote areas down to places where they had access to roads, better access to healthcare and education. Remember that village that I showed here up at the top of the mountain? They are currently paving a concrete road up to this village that I visited. My first week in Bandung, they paved their first road in the village there as well. So just dramatic changes coming in terms of infrastructure development. This is all across the province. The party secretary of Bandung, who was a acquaintance, if not friend, he said it's not a question of if or even when they achieve this, but how they do it. How do they do it to use resources best, and how do they do it in these really hard to reach places? But it's happening, and you see this with high-speed rail as well. This is across the province. This is Tiger Leaping Gorge up in the north of the province, where you see high-speed rail coming through the mountains, as well as a new highway coming through the mountains. And so facilitating access across the province to tourism, access to trade in Southeast Asia as well. Yunnan is well positioned to be a bridge to Southeast Asia rather than a backwater, how it's been traditionally seen. And even Bandung, there's a highway that is set to open at the end of this year that I watched being constructed. When I arrived in Bandung from the capital, Kunming, it was about a 24-hour process, an overnight bus ride, change bus, minivan, hitchhiking to get there. And when that opens at the end of the year, it's expected to be about a 5-hour drive from Bandung to Kunming. So dramatic changes that are taking place. So really, why is all this important? I think it's important that we understand that there's really a strong base of support for the Communist Party, and specifically for President Xi Jinping in these rural areas. And it's not just because of propaganda. It's not just because of state-controlled media or brainwashing, as I think is a easy narrative that we hear. But really, it's because people's lives are better. Materially, their lives are better off than they've ever been before, and they have this man to thank for it. He's the poster child, he's the brainchild. He made it a SMART goal. And so when media was in upheaval 2 years ago, roughly, when they made constitutional changes that allowed Xi to continue to be in power beyond just 10 years, the response that I heard was 20 years of Xi is better than just 10 years. We would love that, for him to continue to make these changes. And I think this is very powerful, because it's not just now. As people lives are better, as they have houses, they remember that as they pass their houses down to the next generation. They remember that. My grandfather, he was a lifelong Democrat. Whatever your US political persuasions are, he was a lifelong Democrat because of the Civilian Conservation Corps that gave him a job and paid him when things were really, really hard during the Depression. This slogan here says, when you're lifted from poverty, don't forget the Communist Party. When you drink water, don't forget the person who dug the well for you. So I think this really captures the Communist Party's intent, but I think also a lot of the internalized sentiment of the people who have benefited from this campaign. I also love this picture because it has a slogan for population control and for hemorrhoids. But most importantly, the significance of the Communist Party to improving people's lives here. And I think this is long lasting, because it's been an incremental process. You know, the last 40 years since reform and opening in the early 80s, when policies started hitting these rural areas, there's just been this continual improvement of life, gradual, and I think people are experiencing that. I talked to a wealthy urbanite who I think who is traveling around the province, and I think that he said it well. It's taken us 70 years to get to this place. And so don't bring your American thinking to China for immediate, radical democratic change. Look at where we've come in 70 years and imagine where we'll be in another 70 years. So I think that was interesting perspective on China's development. So the last thing I'll say, and I'll try to be quick with this, to be clear, yes, I think that the Communist Party will absolutely achieve this goal by 2020. They've invested too much political capital. Xi has invested too much political and financial capital to fail at this. It's not a question of if, it's not a question of when, it is a question of how they do that. So at the end of this year, when you read the headlines about them eradicating rural poverty, I would encourage you, be happy for my neighbors in Guangdong. Rejoice and be grateful that their lives are better. Be happy for the 800 million who have been lifted out of poverty thanks to economic reforms of the last 40 years. And also view those headlines with some skepticism. Remember that it is a low bar. Eradicating poverty sounds grandiose, but it's a very low bar. Again, $500 US annual for a person, very low bar. And so there's a lot of work that remains to be done. It's also a bar that's very hard to measure. This was my landlord, my neighbor there in the village, and he would say, you know, he had one of these files on his door as well, and he would say, you know, before this campaign, here's what my life looked like. My life now, even though I've been officially lifted out of poverty, my life now looks very much the same. The difference for him was free education, a healthcare subsidy of about $50 US per year, and the new bathroom that he got out of the deal. So his question was, what really has changed for me? He still felt very, very poor, and raises the question of how accurate are these metrics? And I think another question of sustainability. Another neighbor of mine, family of 6, 2 parents who were too old to work, 2 young kids in school, a wife who had some mental handicaps, and the husband himself who was an alcoholic and couldn't hold a job. So they were below that line. Sustainability, how do you do that? There's lots of money being thrown at this right now, but how do you sustain that and ensure that people don't continue to fall below the line? I think at the end of the day, this is the answer. The next generation, the kid on the right, Wenjun, he was from Guangdong village. This last year, he sat for the college entrance exam, and he got the highest score, or the 7th highest score in the entire province, which was incredible. So he's studying to be a doctor in Shanghai. His dad, unimaginably proud of this kid's accomplishments. Education is the long-term game plan. My neighbor, who is an alcoholic, his 2 kids, who are now in compulsory education that is free, that is the long-term game plan for these poverty elimination efforts to be sustainable. So I will stop there. Obviously, I could talk much longer about my neighbors. Stories show lots more pictures, but I'll say this before we go to Q&A. Like I said at the beginning, I talked with everyone that I could during my fellowship. Farmers, party secretaries, religious shamans, wealthy urbanite tourists. I also traveled extensively around the province. I had a hard to reach areas on the world, and so gained a lot of insight into U.S.-China relations, into trade issues, into religion, cultural preservation, tourism, trash, tea. I learned a lot about myself in the process, including about loneliness. So anyway, as we go into Q&A, you're welcome to ask follow-up questions about poverty elimination efforts, but would open it up to a wide range of interests that you may have. Feel free to ask anything, and I will stop there.
Matt, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. You mentioned foreign policy, and I just want to, before we go to the audience, I just want to ask the first question, and that is, how much did you talk to the people that you met in Yunnan about that, and how extensive did you feel their understanding of what was going on in the world, China's place in the world, rising place in the world, and also the trade war with the United States is going? Is there any kind of analytical thinking about that? Or is the poverty alleviation campaign essentially lining up the Chinese population, at least in Yunnan, behind whatever Beijing does?
Yeah, good question. I talked with a lot of people about that and tried to get a sense of their perspectives on it. By and large, I found that people in rural areas were not large consumers of information anymore. Most of them have smartphones and can access news if they want it, but by and large, they did not. That wasn't a normal habit. So their perspectives tended to be fairly similar. That, yeah, absolutely lined up with the news coming out of Beijing, their lines on the trade war, that the U.S. started it in order to keep China down, because the U.S. is number one and wants to keep China down. So perspectives tended to be fairly uniform. There was a man in the village at the convenience store. He would sit in his convenience shop and watch the news. He tended to have some interesting perspectives, maybe slightly more outside the norm, and you would come across people like that. But broadly speaking, you would have very strong support for Beijing's policies. Let me add, though, that there was a lot of grumbling as well. So, for example, this poverty elimination campaign, one guy said, 9牛1毛, so like 9 cows and 1 hare. The amount of money that they were getting from the government was just a drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean, rather. Complaints, grumblings about corruption as well. But what was interesting is that they would typically associate that with local implementation in the local party rather than central party leaders or policy, which is a pretty old move in the playbook. That's pretty standard, and I found that to be fairly consistent across the board.
Thanks, Matt. So we'll go to the first question. Again, just to repeat, to ask a question, please click on the hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom box to raise your hand, and we will pick you chronologically. Please introduce yourselves and ask a single brief question. And we'll try to get to everybody, and apologies in advance if we can't. I should also mention, if we've had trouble sort of connecting, that we've maxed out a 100 number of attendees. We will have a video available that we'll send a note out about afterwards. So anybody who wasn't able to join will be able to watch it. So the first question is from Yao Yang.
Hi.
Go ahead, please.
Yao, you might be muted. I can't hear anything.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, there
We
you
can
go.
hear you.
Hi, Yao. Hi, all. This is Yao. I've known Matt for about 10 years. We went to the Hopkins Nanjing Center together. I used to be a journalist in China. Thank you, Matt, for this really awesome talk. I was actually just going to ask about the local implementation corruption and wanted to see if you can speak more to that. What are some of the observations and problems that, you know, from villagers, any kind of resistance? But there's one question that I really wanted to ask is, so you mentioned that there's like a lot of relocation programs, and this is something that I see in kind of especially big infrastructure projects, like hydropower plant, that oftentimes they need to relocate a whole village, probably not Panjang, but a lot of that. And what comes with that kind of program is that changes people's way of living, right? So they used to own lands for generations, and now all of a sudden they have to like figure out a different way. And that seems a really, really big problem from my observation. Have you seen have you talked to people about that? Any kind of like successful or unsuccessful efforts in this aspect?
Yeah.
I think that's my question.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah, saw a number of relocation areas, talked to a number of people. I think by and large, the trend of what people said was they didn't like it, but may banfa, as you're familiar with that phrase, like there's no way about it. So it was kind of this sense of fatalism. There's nothing we can do about it. This is the deal. I don't like it, but I'll make the best of it. So part of the problems was size of places that they were moved into. I met a guy, sat in his apartment. Oh man, I can't even tell you how many square meters. I want to say like 65 square meters, and there were 5 people living in there. They had been relocated from his land and house up in the mountains. So I think that was the general message I heard. Also, frustration that, dramatic change in way of life. You know, I remember talking to one woman who had been moved to a place where, it's just, as you saw, just this long string of concrete structures, which is very different than being on your own land and having space. And the wind was terrible there, and she couldn't grow anything in her garden, and she was just miserable. And yet, she was also resigned to that in the same May Bangfa attitude, and hopeful that it would produce a better life for her granddaughter, who then had better access to education because they had moved there. So it was kind of this give and take in that. But I would also say lots of localization in implementation of this, in terms of what the relocation policies looked like. I actually met a lot of people who still had their land and were able to still farm that, just they weren't able to live there anymore. The hopes of people, again, moving down from the mountains, having closer access to roads, being able to build roads that gave those people access, but complaints about, now it takes me 15 minutes, half an hour to get to my land to work it, rather than living right on my land. So good question, very complicated, broad range of implementation, and broadly speaking, a sense of fatalism about it.
Thanks so much, Matt. Now we'll go to Jan Barris.
Hi, Matt. It's good to see you again. I'm Jan Barris with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And just because of the work I do, which is a lot of exchanges between China and the United States, I'm curious about, I know ICWA can work magic all over the world, but how were you able to get into this very small, remote village? Was it through Ganchi that you already had? Or if not, how did you get there? And then once you got there, rural areas are, no matter where you are in the world, they're pretty closed and they're pretty tight knit. how did you as a stranger, were you able to integrate yourself over the course of your 2 years there? I know obviously as you went on, it got easier, but what did you do at first to get them to trust you and to open themselves up to you and allow you into their lives?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. First of all, thank you for joining. Really appreciate you taking the time today. You nailed it. The connections was really, really critical. I had worked for an organization called Where There Be Dragons that does experiential education programs. And I spent a semester, an academic semester, with a group of students, and we took them to Bangdong Village to do a week-long rural homestay there. This organization had worked with this village for like 8 years, had long-standing relationships, and so I was actually in that village working on my ICWA application, thinking, you know, I'd love to be in a rural area. Where could I be? And the answer was all too obvious. That week, we'd had a chance to speak with the mayor of the village, the party secretary of the nearby town, just incredible access that was so helpful and insightful. And so those connections proved fruitful to allow me to be there and have a certain amount of trust, I think. Now, let me also say there's always a certain amount of distrust as well. And understandably so. When you're with an organization that does have the letter CIA in it, even though not that order, ICWA, and you're going around talking to people, asking questions, somehow you have money to fix up this little house, people are just puzzled by that. And so there were definitely quizzical questions directly to me and behind my back about me being a spy. But one person said it the best, that, man, so many people ask that if you are a spy, you must be the stupidest spy. They told me that directly. So yeah, I think those connections were super important to allow me to be there. And also that I think naturally there's distrust there as well, that you just navigate through. Hopefully you spend time, have conversations with people, and maybe that goes away. But you know, even at the end of my time there, people were still asking that. So you never know.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to read a question that's been written in, and I'm actually going to combine two questions. One is, how exposed are all the people in a village like yours to ever experiencing wealthy cities? What do they aspire to nationally and internationally? And a similar question from Joe Batot. What do people in Bangdong think of the high standard of living in Beijing or Shanghai when they see that on TV?
Yeah, there's actually, I think, quite a bit of exposure. And I think you pointed out on TV, social media, you know, everyone has smartphones now, so they have access to see that. And since the 90s, really, this village, people have been going out to work. A friend of mine there, he worked on some of the buildings there for the Olympics in Beijing in 2008. And so you definitely have that exposure. What do they think about it? I think their experience with the cities is very difficult and very rough. They experience discrimination, even within migrant labor groups. People from Yunnan experience discrimination from migrants from other provinces, because Yunnan is just such a backwater. And so they would, you know, they said, but we stick together, and we, you know, we would fight it out with them. They were all afraid of us, people from Yunnan. And so rough experience. So it's not positive experiences in the big city, broadly speaking. They see the wealth, and they I think psychologically that impacts them. They feel less, and they internalize that discrimination. So I think they feel that psychologically. But I would also say this, and I was very much struck by this. I think there's at least among some people in some rural areas, and Guangdong is not representative of all of rural China. Let me say that. No city, no village is representative of all urban or rural China. But in Guangdong, I sensed a lot of people really starting to see and appreciate a different way of life in their rural community compared to these cities. They didn't like the fast-paced, busy, no community, no one cares about anyone in the cities. They loved the outdoors, they loved their community of working hard, but also having physio and sitting with their neighbors. So the really strong community, and as I mentioned, hospitality. That I think increasingly you have people out to work, but get enough capital to go back to their villages as their parents are aging, to look after their parents, and as their kids are growing up, to allow their kids to grow up. Access to education is improving. Roads are improving. So they don't have to be in these big cities anymore. They can send their kids this city that's 4 hours away for education, or even improved schools 6 miles away in Porto. So I think improved livelihoods gives them hope that they can actually stay in kind of their home culture rather than needing to go out.
Interesting. Next is Cheng Li.
Could you hear me?
Yes, can hear you now.
Oh, man, it's great to see you. And it's really wonderful to see an excellent presentation. I'm so happy that you spent 2 years in Yunnan in poverty-stricken area and have a grassroots observation. It's really represented the best of the ICWA. Really wonderful. I think at the moment, your view is a minority view, but I think it's a very, very important view for US adopt the right policy to correct its own mistake. I'm a former fellow. Currently, as Greg said, I work at the Brookings Institution. I want to extend the invitation to you to speak, sometime maybe later this year or early next year, depend on appropriate subject to speak at our institution. I noticed that Jan Barry was also on the phone. I hope the National Committee will also, and other institutions will give this kind of more independent view at this critical moment in US-China relations. Now, I have a question, a two-part of question. One is, you mentioned about the two non-worries. So that's related to that question. During your 2 years or beyond, did you see any real hunger or starvation in any place, or you visited, or the area you spent some time? Secondly, you talk about the Chinese peasants, their views, their positive views about Xi Jinping, about the Chinese Communist Party. But do you see any contrast between elites, especially intellectuals or liberal intellectuals? But my real question is, do you see this kind of contrast, if there's any, is diverging or converging during the recent tensions in the US-China relation, and also what happened over the past couple of years in terms of the Americans' own problems?
Great question. Thanks so much. And just a personal thank you as well for your support through the duration of this fellowship, conversations and connections, and your extension of an invite. So really appreciate that. So your first question, two non-worries, starvation. I did not witness any amount of starvation, hunger any poverty to that level, to that degree at all anywhere in rural Yunnan that I visited. And like I said, I visited the northwest corner, which is kind of the hinterland of the hinterland. When I visited there the first time to spend Christmas, I think 2018, it was about a 7-hour drive to get there on awful dirt roads. And when I revisited later the following year, they had built a new highway. So really, this is the corner of the corner, and even there, they had enough food. So I was grateful to see that. I'm trying to think, where might be exceptions to that, if there are more remote areas, or areas that they're trying to relocate people, but people are unwilling to relocate, and so they still don't have road access. But yeah, that thankfully, hunger, starvation, not a reality that I saw on the ground, not a part of any conversations that anyone ever mentioned. So grateful for that. As to your second question, views on the Communist Party, and if I can clarify, was your question, what I expressed rural support for Communist parties, was that the same view of elites that I was talking to as well? Were those views aligned or divergent? Am I understanding your question correctly?
I don't think we have Chung on the line. Maybe you can. Oh, there he is.
Yes, this is exactly what I want to ask. And
Okay.
we know from some different views, and China is, as you know well, it's become increasingly pluralistic. But the important thing is that these views, because as you know, that at least some people in Washington, including the State Department, want to pursue regime change and want to separate the Communist Party with Chinese society. And in my view, this will not work. I think your presentation certainly highlighted that. Now the point is that, of course, that liberal intellectuals are far more critical, both the party and President Xi Jinping. But the important thing is whether these views become increasingly diverge with the poor people or general public, or start to converge. I mean, of course, this is an open question. We do not know. It's also very, very dynamic. But I want to get your sense, because I really appreciate your very sharp observation. You really very much engage immune with really kind of integrated with the society so well. So I'm very curious about your observation.
Yeah, so my sense is that, this, what I expressed, rural support, broadly speaking, for the Communist Party is not necessarily the view held by everyone in society. I think, as you point out, there are lots of divergent views. I think, broadly speaking, how it would come down in society is, one, they see that things are improving economically, broadly speaking, for the country. I think everyone across the country would generally speaking agree with that, and I think they would link that to Communist Party leadership in providing social stability, peace across the country, and maneuvering the levers of economic policy that has brought that social stability and economic growth. So I think, broadly speaking, you would find a lot of agreement around there. And where I think it would diverge would be in the political realm. I think was just talking with someone this last week that who is in leadership, but the political environment now versus 10 years ago, dramatically different, much more strict, that you experience under Xi's leadership. And so where it diverges then is elites or people at all sorts in I'd say upper middle class more broadly, that are they appreciate that their lives are better over the last 40, 30, 20 years, but they want more improvements as well. And so the tightening political scene is not welcome. They think the country is going in a negative direction with that. But again, and I think this would perhaps be pervasive. The urban elite that I talked to, that I mentioned earlier, 70 years, we've come a long way. Give us another 70 years. Don't bring your American thinking to how we should do this. It's not going to be immediate. It doesn't have to be immediate. We have access to the outside world. We have the internet and ways to access that. So don't think, what did he say? Don't think that we're stupid melons, is how he said it. 我们不是傻瓜. And so, yeah, I think that view would be fairly common among many in Chinese circles.
So we have a lot of terrific questions still, a lot of people still participating. We've gone more than 5 minutes beyond our time, and maybe we'll go for another sort of 10, 15 minutes or so. Hope everybody can stay with us. I'm going to read a question, actually combine another couple of written questions, and then we'll go back to calling on participants. So I'm just scrolling down. First of all, since Yunnan is so diverse, what were ethnic relations like in the village and with other villages? And another sort of related question, how do you feel those cultures will be affected by the development and new transportation links, including highways and high-speed rail?
Great question, and super relevant to Yunnan. Not very relevant to Guangdong. So Guangdong is actually a Han majority village. Roughly 93% of the Chinese population is ethnically Han. And that was the predominant ethnic group in the village where I was. So in that regard, I think it was culturally, at least, maybe more representative of other rural areas in China. So I was grateful for that. And so there wasn't a strong sense of that in my village. However, Yunnan itself is the most ethnically diverse province in all of China. And so I got to travel around quite a bit. Yunnan is also touted as the tourism heaven of China. And tourism is a huge part of poverty elimination strategies of places. Even Guangdong is as roads go in and you have more access, they're thinking, how do we bring tourists here? There's quite the plan at least in some people's minds, in leadership to try and turn that into like a health and wellness resort town. We'll see how that goes. But ethnic tourism around the province, super common, closely linked to poverty alleviation efforts, and the high-speed rail, the highways providing access to these places is a huge part of that being feasible for the first time ever. You saw the photo of Tiger Leaping Gorge with high-speed rail and highway jutting through the mountain. So the question is, how does that affect places? I think it can affect places in wonderful ways, bring a lot of economic benefit to places. And I think it also brings challenges with that. Challenges like inequality and cultural preservation. How do we make sure that it's the local people actually benefiting from that? And how do we help develop places where that is shared by the community? So a couple examples of that. Yubong is a place way up north. They got their first road into this backpackers haven last year. And so I visited this place well off the beaten path. And you have the locals that have lived there forever. And now these outsiders that are coming in and trying to develop tourism, build hostels, capitalize on the tourists that are starting to pour in there. Again, benefits to the local community that was once cut off, and subsistence farming that now, it's booming, money hand over fist in the area. But a lot of challenges. Environmentally, how do you preserve that area? Regarding the cultural preservation, another example is a place called Ongding village right on the border with Myanmar, that they tout it as the last primal tribal village in China. It's the Wa people, Wa ethnic minority, grass roofed, thatched huts, mud walls, or wood, I guess, kind of architecture there. And so the government has come in and said, hey, this is an amazing place. We want to develop tourism here. Sometimes it's private companies that come in and do that. And then they come in, invest all this money. Usually what you see is actually, kind of cleaning up the place, but standardizing things and taking away what was unique about it, and bringing in, one of the things they did was the skull, cow skull is representative of in their culture, but they hung like thousands of cow skulls all along the road leading into this village, which is just not authentic, and doing other sorts of things like that are not authentic, but that's what the tourists want to see. So how do you preserve the authentic culture of this place while bringing in those tourist dollars, while maintaining some sense of economic equality for them? Very, very difficult things. The last thing I'll say about it is, generally when we saw this, and speaking to some academics about this issue as well, it seemed like the winning model for that was those local communities having a say in that process, self-determination being a significant part of that process, and having a local leader or a benevolent outside leader coming in and facilitating conversation and brainstorming and leadership within the local community that could lead that process and represent them, especially as government interests came in or private companies came in to develop. So super challenging issue. Yeah, we'll see how it develops in the next 5 years. It'll be interesting to see. Great question, very relevant.
We'll go next to the next person in line. I don't see a name. It's LOHC.
Hi, Matt. It's Chris, actually. It's great to see you. Matt and Matt and I spent some time together in Beijing. I spent a lot of my life in Beijing. And just to reiterate, great presentation. I remember talking to you about, just having similar curiosities and questions about rural China. Living in Beijing, you don't really get that perspective at all. And, just your presentation has been fantastic. I'm looking forward to more conversations about this personally, and also your book. I'm already a great fan. I have kind of two questions. That's one question. I'm curious about the COVID-19 situation, and if you are still in contact with the people in Bandung, and what the situation is there. The COVID-19, I think, has affected all of us globally. China has done really well to keep it under control, and taken great measures to protect citizens. How has that affected the village and the people there, and Yunnan in general?
Yes, very relevant question. Let me start with the big picture in rural China. So what the big picture looks like is very few cases got into rural China, locked down fairly quickly, and prevented migration, people moving across areas. And so that was very significant in preventing widespread. An example of that, so Lincang, the prefecture where Bandung village is located, they had one case in the entire prefecture, and that was a guy from Wuhan, the center of where it all started, they say. who was coming out to Linzhang to see his girlfriend. And they actually caught him in the Kunming airport. No, they caught him in the Linzhang airport, I think by a temperature check. And they took him immediately to Kunming for quarantine and for treatment. He didn't even get to see his girlfriend. What a failed trip. So anyway, just to illustrate the lockdown in travel. So very few cases across rural China. And so very little direct impact in terms of disease, Guangdong included. But you had lots of indirect impact, and we'll see how this plays out. But the biggest is just economic, as you might imagine. So Stanford REAP, Rural Education Action Project, I think, Scott Rozelle, he leads that group, and they did a survey across rural China that estimated about 100 billion in wages lost across rural China. So that would be predominantly migrant workers who would go out to work in urban areas who are not getting paid during quarantine. You know, if you're an urban worker working from home or unable to work, broadly speaking, they're getting paid. Rural workers, not so much. And about 54% of rural workers still unemployed. And that affects their finances. It affects food, it affects healthcare. So very significant for them. There was another study by CAS, the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. They suggested where it's going to hit economically is also in agricultural inputs. So fertilizer, seed, feed for livestock, supply chains being messed up for those, you know, not being able to plant or not having livestock for a season. And so no access to those or increased cost for those. That's going to have significant economic influence. So, and I think we're yet to see how those impacts play out even in terms of, you know, what they were able to plant, you know, after another growing season, how that affects things. So that's big picture rural China, my take from COVID. At a granular level for Guangdong, how we saw it playing out. Again, no cases in Guangdong, but we had people who were going around with their pesticide sprayers, spraying down everything in the village. What they were spraying, some sort of disinfectant, but that was their response. Setting up barricades across their roads so that no outsiders could pass through the area. One person from the village was allowed to leave the village every day in order to go to nearby town in order to purchase medicine for people or food for people, supplies. So that's how it worked out in Guangdong. But thankfully, things are back to normal for them. We'll see how it affects the tea crop is fine, but we'll see how it affects demand for tea this year.
So we're 20 minutes now over, but we still have 90 people tuned in. So Matt, you tell me if you're okay to go for a couple more questions.
Let's go for it. Thanks everyone for joining. I really appreciate it.
So let's combine. Let's have two questions. We'll have two questions maybe. Next is Tori Widowsoon, and then Christopher Gartner. And then go ahead, and then Matt, you can answer both questions, and then I'll have finish with one question from me.
Great.
Hey Matt, can you hear me okay? Cool. So Tori Widowson, actually some similar trajectory in terms of Hopkins Nanjing Center. And I also lived in a village, but in a very different one on the East Coast, much more prosperous and benefited from tourism. So some understanding of doing up a house and being treated weirdly. The question I have, and you've slightly alluded to it, but it's a specific one about, I think it's fantastic what they've done, and I'm fully in agreement in terms of the poverty alleviation, but it is a low barrier. My village was very get up and go about their own tourism development. But as you say, there is this need potentially for these benevolent facilitators. I really like that phrase. albeit I think they are few and far between. Students or young people, the idea that there was this government policy of going down to the villages or the rural areas to help, it was kind of coming in the last couple of years. I heard about it, but I never saw it because in my province it wasn't really needed. Did you come across any examples of that, sort of for good, for bad, across Yunnan province, or if it wasn't young people, other people coming to offer skills or help?
Thanks for your question, Tori. It's good to hear from you. Yes, I just for background for everyone else, I got to visit Tori's village. Yeah, very different in terms of development, but also, yeah, very unique perspective. She lived there for, I think, well over a decade. So yeah, good perspective. I did not see that specifically anywhere, you know, some sort of modern go down youth program. You know, obviously back in the day, President Xi Jinping, he was a go down youth for 7 years, which I think in part informs his policies for rural China. But I didn't see that in practice at all when I was there. The two exceptions I might say for that would be teachers. So the teacher there was a teacher in our village, a young guy who was from elsewhere in Yunnan, a city or at least larger urban center in Yunnan, I forget where. But he was eager to work there. One, because it was meaningful work. He found purpose in that work in benefiting rural communities. He had a heart for that, you could say. But also, and this was interesting, the pay and the benefits of it were better than many urban areas where he would have opportunity for other work. And the reason for that was very intentional in order to promote education opportunities, getting better teachers into these rural areas. Because again, education, I think, is their long game, the long play at alleviating poverty. And as they move into the rural vitalization campaign, which I think is the next phase after this poverty elimination campaign. So again, policies for teachers to get them in rural areas where they could actually make and save more money, especially because cost of living differential by having a rural post for several years rather than an urban post. The other exception would be tourism, where you have people from urban centers, a lot of young people who, you know, a little bit more entrepreneurial or want to live a different life, live the slow life. They don't like the city life, or middle-aged people who have, you know, worked in big cities for 20 years, sick of the go, and kind of have this, you know, idyllic rural countryside picture in their mind, and so they move to the middle of nowhere, open up a guest house, a hostel, you know, arts and crafts shop, that type of thing. So those would be the two exceptions. Again, not a formal go down youth sort of program, but people who were moving to these areas, bringing new ideas, bringing capital as well.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, we meant to combine the questions, but Christopher Gardner, please go ahead.
Hi, Chris Gertner, a longtime friend of Matt's as well as a bandmate of his.
Yes.
And he can talk about that if he wants to. But my question had to do, I believe it was touched on a little bit about the environmental impact of China's plan for poverty elimination, as far as, you know, the highways, the rail systems going out to places, you know, as far off as places that you had been working in. And I guess there's two sides of it. One is government research into, okay, how's this going to impact things environmentally in China, both on a national scale, but also with bigger picture issues like global, like climate change, and then sort of on the level in which you were interacting daily, how much were those kind of questions a part of conversation or of thinking? You know, like if such and such highway is built, how's it going to affect, you know, whatever it may be, rivers or, yeah, what would the impact that they would, what is the impact they would feel from that kind of massive infrastructure build?
Yeah, a really important question. And let me start at the kind of daily life level, how I saw that and experienced that. As I was renovating this house, produced a whole bunch of trash. Well, as I cleaned out this house that I moved into, basically it had been left like a tree fort for men with lots of beer bottles and cigarettes and playing cards and a whole bunch of trash in there, clothes. You know, what do you do with this trash? In the village, there were basically two options. One, dump it in the down the hillside in the ravines and the water gullies, or two, burn it. And in terms of environmental, you know, protection, neither of those are great options. So that was a huge challenge there in the village. Over the course of my time there, they actually developed a trash management program where they distributed oil drums throughout the village and then had a big diesel truck come through, and they would shovel the trash from these oil drums into this diesel truck and then haul it about 10-20 minutes outside of the village and dump it down this big log road. And then once that road filled up, they would bulldoze it. Well, they would light it on fire, and then they would bulldoze it back, and then repeat. So basically, it's still getting burned, but the benefit is that it's not getting dumped down these gullies. So better for the water, I guess. So a little bit disheartening. At the same time, what's interesting and what I heard as I talked to party leadership about this and the person in charge of this program is he would say, it's not perfect, but it's a start, and it's where we'll start and we'll improve it as we go. So how long does it take to make the next improvement, to develop the next plan and implement? I don't know. There was little environmental awareness around there, which is challenging, especially I think when it's a tea village that we think of as beautiful and pristine, and when they're talking about perhaps developing tourism. Environmental awareness is actually important to that, and I think that's a huge barrier to this vision for the area, because you don't have that awareness or really a willingness to act on that in the village. So that's challenging. Bigger picture, roads going in, Yunnan dams going in, hydroelectric power, super important and challenging. And so how government awareness of that, it's challenging right now. I think in some ways there's awareness and lots of efforts being made around climate change, around electric vehicles, things like that. China's well aware that they have a huge population and well aware that the impact that will have on the environment if everyone in China lives like the elite in China, or everyone in China lives like your typical American, the impact that would have on the environment. So I think there's an importance of that on China's agenda, and I think they rightly see this as something that they can collaborate with countries around the world on and improve global relations in that area, and maybe clash with the US or look better than the US in that area as well. So I think that's significant. But challenges, I read an article this last week about the peafowl, so an endangered bird in Yunnan, and some construction on some dam had been stopped because they discovered this bird that they had actually done environmental research tests in this area, before they started building the dam. The test research never showed anything about this bird that it would be affecting. But interestingly enough, the firm that was contracted to do this research test was also a stakeholder in the construction company. And so, this conflict, very obvious conflict of interest that was not noted at the time of beginning of construction. So I think discouraging, because that's, I think, fairly commonplace across these development projects, whether tourism, roads, dam construction. I think that's fairly commonplace, but also encouraging because they actually stopped construction on this. I think increasingly when these things are coming to light, there are voices and high-level voices that are willing to take action to make things better around that. So mixed bag, tremendous challenge, and yeah, Yunnan very very diverse in terms of ecology, environment, very important and very valuable. And I think as the tourism continues to develop, they're beginning to realize more and more how valuable that environment is. And so hopefully we'll be a little bit more mindful of that as they see the economic value of the environment. We shall see.
Unfortunately, we can't get to all the questions. We've had a really quite a broad representative number of them. I just want to finish by asking you one more question, Matt, and that is, so while spending 2 years living among villagers, how difficult did you find it to write objectively, about their daily lives? Surely there were many things you didn't agree on, perhaps political philosophy chief among them. Nevertheless, you were able to balance empathy and understanding with your role as an ICWA fellow, which is being an impartial observer, trying to get at the roots of what makes society tick. How difficult were sort of these two maybe opposing feelings and motives?
Yeah, I think, so I went in hopefully with a clean slate, really not knowing what I would find, not knowing how people thought about things, how they viewed things. And so a sincere desire to learn that. I knew very well that my job wasn't to convince them of anything else or shift mindsets. Even with the trash issue, I connected with a local or a Chinese activist who's at the forefront of rural trash management, and in part I was like, oh my gosh, like I want to work with her and develop a trash program for Bangdong, because I love this place and these people are wonderful. But I also, I think realistically, I hope this is correct. I sensed that was not my place. My place was to be there and to talk to people and listen and learn. My place was not to convince them of my perspectives or US perspectives on things. Granted, I was happy to share perspectives if people were interested in that. And all of that may be to my credit, perhaps to my discredit. There were moments when I would be frustrated with conversations, or moments when I would be defensive about my country and its policies, or embarrassed about my country and its policies, or offended at other people's views of my country and its policies. So there was a whole challenge in that. But broadly speaking, and I hope that this comes through in my writing isn't necessarily all my opinion. I'm not writing to express my opinion. My hope was to write to express these people's perspectives and their views and allow other people a window into their lives, understand how they see things, and kind of leave it at that, more or less, because I think they're valuable views to understand whether we agree with them or not. So that was my hope. And I think in my heart and mind, I received so much wisdom and learned so much from the people that I was around and the conversations that I had. Again, whether I agree with it or not, but that certainly shapes my understanding of what their experience is and how I understand policies coming out of Beijing and US-China relations as well.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for a really a terrific fellowship report. And I have to say, your fellowship was really spectacular. Not only did you really get into the wilderness, and you really made the most of it, and you got people's stories, and you wrote about them well, and you told narratives. Really, truly amazing. I recommend your writing and your upcoming book to everybody. Sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. Thank you so much for taking part. We will have video of this available shortly on our website, www.icwa.org. Thank you very much again for taking part, and best of luck.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you joining. Thanks so much, Greg, for facilitating, and again, your support throughout the fellowship.